I'm Bruce Hammer. This is a class on the residential purchase agreement. I actually just updated this prop today. Wendy, if you'd like to download a copy of the prop that I have on the screen, you click the link that you see in the chat window, and that'll enable you to get a copy onto your screen as well. Let's see.
Okay.
All righty. So everything that you're going to see today is in the exact same order that it will come out, that'll be produced when you order a residential purchase agreement or when you set up a residential purchase agreement contract using your Zip Forms subscription. The first document that you're going to have is going to be residential. Hang on a second. I want to. If you can, Wendy, if you can mute yourself. Ivan, you can mute yourself once you get on. All right. So again, this is the first document in the residential purchase agreement package. Just like when you list a property, it's going to be the first document, and that's because the first thing you need to do is provide the disclosure regarding real estate agency relationships to your client, whether that's a listing seller or a buyer that you're representing, getting ready to write an offer on. A couple things I want to point out on the disclosure regarding real estate agency relationships. Of course, this discusses your fiduciary duty that you owe to your client, depending on who that client is. If you're representing the seller, your fiduciary duty is to use your skills, basically your skills, to get that seller the highest price for the best terms. If you're representing a buyer, your fiduciary duty is to get that buyer into the property for the lowest price and the best terms. But there's a crossover between your duties owed to your clients and duties owed to everyone involved in the transaction. And that is described under each duties to the seller and duties to the buyer. If you look at letter B, where it says it's under duty to buyer and the seller, same with down here, it says a duty of honest and fair dealing and good faith. What that means is, in addition to your fiduciary duty owed to your client, you still owe a duty of honest and fair dealing and good faith to the other party of the transaction. So you can't be doing shady stuff. Doesn't mean you can't negotiate hard. Doesn't mean you can't, work in your client's best interest, but you can't do shady stuff. There's also three types of agency that are discussed here. You have a seller's agent, a buyer's agent, and then you have this little anomaly right here where it's an agent representing both the seller and the buyer. And that is also known as dual agency. A lot of agents, hold on a second. A lot of agents think of dual agency under the example that I'm going to give here. Let's just say, Ivan, you list a house and you're holding an open house on it this Sunday. Another agent, a buyer walks through the front door of your open house and he sees you there. You start chatting. He looks around the house and he says, dang, I like this house. I want to buy it. And so you write an offer for the buyer. So now you're representing the seller and the buyer. That is what most agents believe is dual agency. But there's a second dual agency, and it's really important to recognize that. And that's where you have any two agents that are with the same office. So, in Sac Metro here, we have, I don't know what it is today, but let's just say 275 agents. If you list the property, Ivan, and another agent in the office, say Wendy, sees the property in the MLS and says, well, dang, I've got a client that would be interested in that property. And she schedules an appointment, shows the client the property, and and her buyer decides they want to buy it. They write an offer. Ivan, you present that offer to the seller. You may have never met Wendy. If you ran into her, you may never know who she is. But if the second your client accepts that offer, you're in a dual agency situation. Wendy, it would be important to recognize that when you write the offer, you're writing an offer that is going to be dual agency. So once we get to the residential purchase agreement, there's a section on the first page of the contract where it's asking, who the broker and agent are that's representing the seller, who's the broker and agent that's representing the buyer, and it's asking for your brokerage license numbers, and it's asking for your individual license numbers. If those license numbers for the brokerage are the same, then there are boxes you need to check that state that each of you are representing both the buyer and the seller, and that it's dual agency. That is a requirement under California law that you disclose that to both clients, that this is dual agency. And as I said, it's dual agency if you personally are representing both the buyer and seller, or if two agents within the same office are representing buyer and seller. All right. And of course, you're going to have your client, the buyers, sign here on the bottom of the first page of the agency agreement. You will sign next to your name. This is the brokerage's DRE license number. So this is the license number for Keller Williams SAC Metro. And then this is my personal license number. And it'll be the same for you. The second page of the agency disclosure, this is the civil code legalese version of the agency disclosure requirements. It does give some definitions that you might find interesting if you're having trouble falling asleep one night. Defines what an agent is, listing price, offering price, seller, and a bunch of other stuff. But you don't need to explain or go through the second page with your clients. The next page you're going to get in this package. And again, I didn't choose each of these individual documents. All I chose in zip forms was the California Residential Purchase Agreement. It automatically compiles this package with all of these other forms in this order. All right. So it makes it easy for you. But the next page is the Fair Housing and Discrimination Advisory. I do a separate class on fair housing, but just to cover a couple high points here so you understand what it is. Fair housing, most people, if you talk about fair housing, you think about racial discrimination. And while that is definitely true, and that's probably the most prevalent form of fair housing violations, there's many others. There's discrimination against groups pertaining to disability, both mental and physical, age, medical conditions, citizenship, sexual orientation, gender, marital status, all of these. And they list a large number of them here. There are actually more than this, though. The fair housing laws derive, first of all, fair housing laws determine if you've discriminated based on classifications of people. And these here are various classifications. And where do these classifications come from? Well, they come from a combination of California statutory law, California constitutional law, federal statutory law, and federal constitutional law. The overwhelming majority come from the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. So they're based on pretty substantial law that we pay tribute to and honor in this country. There are also substantial penalties against people that violate fair housing laws. Some are criminal, some are civil. In terms of civil, I guarantee you that if you're found to have violated fair housing in California, you're going to lose your real estate license. No ifs, ands, or buts. So, how do agents typically get into trouble in California? Well, most agents don't get up in the morning and say, let me think, how can I discriminate against somebody today? That's not something that usually happens. See, I don't think you have to worry about that. Most agents get into trouble because they do something, frankly, that's just stupid. May not be stupid, maybe that's too strong of a word, but it's born out of ignorance because they say something they might think is trying to help somebody, but it turns out what they're doing is actually enforcing, for example, racial discrimination, and in the long run, you're harming the person. So a couple of those examples. Biggest example of that would be channeling or steering, and the way that happens. And I'm going to try to use a real life example for you. You guys are out there, you're beating the bushes for business, trying to find, buyers and sellers, and maybe you're doing some advertising, maybe you're handing out flyers, maybe you're doing marketing, whatever. Anyway, you get a call from somebody in the Bay Area, and as it turns out, they are looking to buy a house now in Sacramento because since the pandemic, their company has gone remote. And so they no longer need to commute to downtown San Francisco for their job. So they no longer are locked out of the real estate market, and they're able to afford to buy properties. So where would be a natural place to buy a property where you don't have to pay Bay Area prices? Well, Sacramento's a good area. And so they can buy a home here now. They can work from home because they have their Zoom meetings and they do everything online. And that's what they want to do. So they contact you based on your marketing. They got your name somehow. They contact you and they say, yeah, looking to buy a house in Sacramento. Can you help me? And you say to them, absolutely. Let me ask you, can you send me, have you talked to a lender yet? Have you gotten your finances straight, or are you going to be paying cash? And they say, well, we've got our pre-approval letter here. They send that off to you, and then you get that pre-approval letter. So the next thing you want to do is schedule a fact-finding meeting with them. You can do that over phone. You can do it in person. Anyway, you're chatting with them, and you're trying to get some pointed information. You want to know what areas they want to, or let me back up. You want to know what type of house they're looking for: single story, 2-story, older, newer, how many square feet, how many bedrooms do they need? Do they care if it's, more modern? Are they okay with something older? What's their price range? All those typical questions that you're going to want to get answers to. And then you get to the subject of where they want to live. And they don't know Sacramento. They say, I don't know, we don't know the area. And you say, okay. And because, and this is where I get into the topic of ignorance, you say, okay. And in your mind, you believe the person to be, let's just say for purposes of this example, an African American. And you state to that person, well, let me send you some MLS listings in your price range and your criteria for this particular area. And the area you choose is an area that you believe that other minorities are going to be comfortable living in. And that's a bad decision for you to make because that's not your decision. And if you were to do that, it could be argued that you were steering people into that area. And so the better way to handle that question from somebody would be, well, I'll tell you what, since you don't know the area, I'm going to set up searches for you, and you're going to get a bunch of properties all over the city of Sacramento at first. I need you to go through those, take a look at the types of housing that you see in those areas, and pick a few, drive by those areas. See if any of those areas in particular interest you. And then if you find something that interests you, let me know. I can focus I can, narrow down your searches into those areas so that you'll get more in those areas and less in other areas. And then what I'm trying to say is let them decide what areas they want to live in if they're not certain. And then the next question you're going to get that has to do with this is, well, how safe is this area? Well, the way you can answer that is, you can say to them, I'm really not allowed to address safety issues because under federal and state law, that could be considered a fair housing violation. And you have to realize too, what's safe to you may not be safe to me. Now, in my example, when I'm talking to them about this, my standard spiel was, look, I'm a former Marine. I'm an ex-cop. I carry a concealed weapon with me. So what's safe to me is not necessarily what's going to be safe to you. We all have our own opinion of that. And so, you're going to have to make that decision, but I can help you a little bit. What I can tell you is there are many, many websites that address crime statistics within zip codes. So you can Google crime statistics for 95835. And you will be able to get crime statistics, for that particular zip code. Same question goes for schools. What's the quality of that school district or those schools? Well, again, you want to avoid answering that question directly, but you can steer, that's a bad word. You can direct them towards websites that rate schools and school districts. And that's the best way to handle it. That way they're doing that form of research and you cannot be accused of steering them into an area because of their race or, or color, or, whatever it is. The other one that I want to caution you about, and this is one that is, I wouldn't even say this is ignorance or stupidity. I think this is just being shady, but this is also one where realtors get into trouble, and that's blockbusting. And the example I would give you there is where, and I pull this from a real life example I'm aware of, but many years ago in the mid 2000s, I sold a lot of homes in Natomas Park. And I listed a house there, and the house that I listed, it backed to an open field that you can see. It's near the charter school off of Del Paso Road. And there's a big open field. I think it's probably about a quarter mile wide and a couple miles long. And it runs between Del Paso Road and Elkhorn Boulevard. And it's still big open field to this day. But in the mid 2000s, early 2000s, there was a husband and wife real estate team, and the husband was door knocking, and he happened to door knock the house that I listed. And his spiel was something to the effect of this: hey, I'm, Joe Realtor with such and such real estate company. I'm introducing myself. Just wanted to know, are you aware that the city of Sacramento is going to be building low-cost housing in the low-income housing right in back of your home in that vacant field? And of course, once that happens, the kind of clientele that low-income housing brings in is going to cause the crime rates here to just to go through the roof. So once that happens, your property value is going to start going down. So if you're ever interested in selling your house, now would be a good time to really give that some consideration. Well, the reality is he was lying. There has never been any low-income housing built there. But even if he was telling the truth, that would have been in violation of the blockbusting rules, and it would have been a fair housing violation. So, and ironically, that particular agent was African American, which made it even crazier that he was doing stuff like this. But that's an example of blockbusting. So don't do it. Let's see. And of course, you're going to have your buyers sign this form at the time you write the offer. It'll go over to the seller. if the seller accepts your offer, their agent will have his client sign this stuff also. And then the Grubers and the Smiths will be under contract. This form here, possible representation of more than one buyer or seller, disclosure and consent, also known as the PRBS. And when you search forms in zip forms, you can search under either the full name or you can search under the initials. So just know that too. This form here, it was originally designed because there was a lawsuit involving Coldwell Banker, I think, in Southern California. Basically, a seller who this Coldwell Banker office listed their property, listed more than one property on the same street. Somebody else came along, a buyer also represented by that office, and that buyer bought the Coldwell Banker home that was listed second instead of the one that was listed first. The homeowner, seller of the home that was listed first, sued Coldwell Banker, stating that they steered that buyer to the other seller's listing instead of their house. And it was a BS suit. It didn't go anywhere. It was dismissed. But in order to combat allegations like that, basically CAR put together this form and it says, look, we represent multiple buyers and multiple sellers. We don't decide what home a buyer decides to buy. The buyer does. So if they buy somebody else's home, don't sue us. It also gives a second description of dual agency, which, you know, I'm an avid believer that the more disclosure, the better. Every time something like this is disclosed throughout, a transaction process, it makes our position stronger if somebody comes back later to claim they didn't understand that. But the really important thing I love about this form is this little clause right here. And I've got to confess, most agents don't understand this. If you're representing a buyer, you put together this offer or any offer and send it over to the seller side, there is no guarantee that that listing agent or seller will keep that offer confidential from other buyers unless you tell them in writing that you want to maintain confidentiality of your client's offer. That agent, that listing agent, is free to play your offer against the other offers, trying to get competitive bidding and drive up the price. So if you ever want your offer to remain confidential, make sure you put it in writing that that offer needs to be held in confidence. All right, again, buyer's going to sign, seller's going to sign, buyer's brokerage will sign here, my signature, seller's brokerage will sign here. And then we have a wire fraud and electronic funds transfer advisory. This became necessary because we have a bunch of little trolls that sit in warehouses in Russia, places like Russia, Nigeria, even the Ukraine, and they pose as title companies, and they look for recent pending sales in through the MLSs and other syndicated websites, and then they do what they do best. They find out contact information for buyers and sellers, and they try to get people to give account numbers that they can use to help them part with their hard-earned money. This is just one more method of putting them on notice that if they get a request for their account number, routing number, so on and so forth, make sure they know who they're giving it to. And finally, we get to the California Residential Purchase Agreement and Joint Escrow Instructions, also known as the RPA. So this form, you notice nowhere in the title do you see the word contract, right? But it doesn't have to say contract to be a contract. Certainly not here in California, not in most states. The only thing that's required to make it a contract is you have parties listed, So the buyers are listed here. The sellers are listed on another page that we'll get to later. Sellers are listed later. You have to have a description of the item being sold. In this case, it's 123 Test Street, City of Sacramento, Sacramento County, and we have a parcel number. So we have complete identification of the subject matter of the contract. Make note when you fill one of these out, don't be lazy. Please check the tax records. Put the parcel number here. Otherwise, when this contract gets to compliance review here, it's going to get kicked back on you. And then you're going to have to go back to your client and have them sign additional documentation to clarify what the property is. So if you don't want to have to do that, fill it out right the first time. And it has to have the buyers and sellers' signatures on the contract, and a date to perform. Date to perform is here. So combining all these documents, and of course, as you learned in real estate school, you have to have consideration. Consideration is the purchase price. So you combine all this stuff, and again, from real estate school, if you recall the classes you took and the tests you had to take and all that good stuff, a contract for the sale of real property. Hold on one moment. A contract for the sale of real property under the Statute of Frauds must be in writing. Now, for our purposes here, we're using this California Association of Realtors zip forms, fancy schmancy real estate purchase contract. If you go to other parts of the state of California, they have something that is similar that they call a California residential purchase contract, but their contract is produced by a different company and looks a little bit different. It's produced by a company called Professional Publishing. So why am I telling you that? Because you might very well list the property in Sacramento, but a buyer in a different part of the state has an agent that wants to put an offer in on it. And so you get this weird looking document that you've never seen before from Professional Publishing, or maybe it was even drafted by an attorney. And you get this purchase offer. And I just want you to understand that just because it looks different doesn't mean it's not a valid purchase offer, and it wouldn't form a valid contract. So hold on one moment. I need to pause this for just a moment. I apologize. I have a garage door technician heading over to my house, and I need to let my wife know. So. Customer service is amazing. When I make an appointment and I tell them to call my wife's phone number for confirmation when they're headed over, and they still call me. Anyway, where was I? Okay, Statute of Fraud says contracts for the sale of real property or the lease for more than a year must be in writing to be valid. But the interesting little tidbit on that is that there is actually a court case in California, went all the way to the state Supreme Court, that basically said they're not going to determine the adequacy of a writing. In other words, a writing doesn't have to be this formal multi-page document that we're talking about here. The majority of the stuff that's covered in this document is not required under contract law. It's added into here in order to protect buyers, sellers, agents, and whatnot. The court case I'm referring to in California had a real estate contract written out on a paper napkin from a restaurant. It was dated, it contained the names of the parties, and it said, I am buying your property at such and such address for X amount of money to close on a certain date. Both parties signed it. And one later tried to claim that it didn't meet the requirements of the statute of frauds and tried to get out of the transaction. Court said it actually did. So the reason I'm telling you this is because I don't want you to get fixated on this particular form to understand this is a contract. Contracts might look a lot different depending on where they come from. People write contracts different ways. They put different things in them. They'll check different boxes, and you'll see as we go, there are a number of options. Just know that there are certain practices you should follow to best protect yourself and your client, and that's what we're going to try to cover on this. On the first page, the upper section, remember I told you you're going to identify, so if you're writing the contract, you're going to want to look at the multiple listing service so that you can see the details about the listing agent and the listing office. So if you did that, you would see that the seller, the listing brokerage, is a company, and I just made this up, Sellers Realty. And this is their broker corporate license number. That's what you would find in MetroList. The agent, Vin Diesel, I guess he wasn't making enough money acting, so he had to supplement his income. He's representing just the seller in this case. It's not dual agency. Now, if Vin Diesel worked for Keller Williams Realty Sac Metro, and this office license number here was the same as his office license number, then you would want to check this box here to indicate that the broker represents both the buyer and the seller as dual agent, right? And with the buyer's brokerage, you would do the same thing if that were the case. You check this box right here. And then you would also check that they're representing both the buyer and they're both the buyer and the seller's agent. You do that on both of these spots. So you just identify it clearly on this page. In this case, different brokerages. So Vin with Sellers Realty is representing the seller only. Me with Keller Williams Sac Metro, I'm representing the buyer only. Okay. Moving on. This is where you put, your major terms. Purchase price. In this case, we're offering $500,000. If it were an all cash buyer, you're going to check this box here. Close of escrow. You have two choices. You can put a certain number of days after acceptance, or you can put a specific date. I've always been partial to using a certain number of days after acceptance. And my logic is, even though we're writing this offer today, June 6th, it doesn't become a valid contract until either the seller accepts the offer, which might be a couple days, or until the buyer accepts a counteroffer from the seller. All right, it's going to be the latest date in that negotiation. And then if the buyer sent another counteroffer over to the seller and the seller finally accepted that, whatever date that happened, that's going to be your contract date. And so you never know if I were to put a date 30 days from today as the close date, and it takes 5 or 6 days to negotiate the contract, I may not have enough time to do my inspections, get an appraisal, get the loan, underwritten and the docs prepared and signing and all that good stuff. So that's why I prefer to put a number of days after acceptance. Expiration of offer, the default is 3 days after all buyer signatures. So if the buyer signs this today and we send it over to the seller, 3 days from today being day 0 at 5 p.m. So today is Tuesday. So if I sent it over signed by the buyer today, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday at 5 p.m., this offer would expire. Once it expires, it can't be accepted. It's a dead deal. That's one of the ways that a contract dies, is by expiration. The other way is by rejection, by death of the offeror. There's a few other ways, but we don't need to go into those. So if you just take the default, the offer is good for 3 days after the date the buyer signs. Initial deposit amount. That amount can vary. I try to do at least 1%. You can go up to 3%. It really doesn't, it doesn't make any difference if you go above 3%. The purpose of the initial deposit is to put some money into escrow if the offer is accepted that the seller could use to exercise the liquidated damages clause if the buyer breached the contract. The California courts have said that there's a limit to the amount of liquidated damages that are considered reasonable, and they have pegged that limit at no more than 3% of the purchase price. So if you go more than 3%, it doesn't mean anything, but in terms of the liquidated damages provision, the most that the seller could retain would be up to 3%. Increased deposit, this section here is almost never used on an initial offer. Sometimes after a contract is formed, and we call that when a contract is formed, we call that contract ratification. That means you have a binding contract between buyer and seller. After formation of the contract, we will often have situations because the seller is not confident, for example, that the buyer is going to be able to perform, and the buyer doesn't want to be forced to cancel and doesn't want the seller to cancel on them. So, the buyer might say something like, look, I will increase my earnest money deposit, and since I've already removed all my contingencies, if I can't get the loan, if you give us a 1-week extension and I still can't get the loan, you'll be able to get my deposit. Well, if that deal is to work that way, another factoid about California law, if a buyer increases their earnest money deposit after the original contract formation, they need to expressly state, meaning in writing, that they are agreeing to add that additional increased deposit to their earnest money and make it available as liquidated damages in the event that clause is executed. And so in order to do that, the buyer and seller need to execute this form DID that's referenced here. So if you're ever in a situation where a seller is stating, well, we want you to increase your deposit. Okay, here's a little exercise in fiduciary duty. You're representing the buyer, someone else is representing the seller. You already removed all your contingencies, and the lender that you're working with is having trouble getting their act together, and you're going to have to delay the closing by a week. The seller's not happy about that. So the seller's agent says to you, okay, fine. You've already removed all your contingencies. We want you to increase your earnest money deposit to a full 2%. from 1% to 2%. So in this case, you're going from 5,000 to 10,000. Well, it is not your job to instruct the other agent that your client also, if they want to make this available for liquidated damages, that your client also needs to complete this DID form. The other agent requests it from you. Obviously, you want to work with him, in good faith, and you'll have your client execute it. But it's not your job to tell the other agent how to do their job. Now, if you're on the listing side and you're in that situation, you want to make sure that the buyer's side not only increases the deposit, but fills out this form DID. Okay. So, and that is not considered bad faith by not telling the other agent how to do their job, or by failing to tell the other agent how to do their job. They're in this business, they're supposed to know that. All right. Now you get down to your loan amount. In this case, he was going to finance 80% of the purchase price, which means they're putting $100,000 down, which is $95,000 plus their $5,000 earnest money deposit, or $100,000. You noticed here, I checked that they're going to have an initial adjustable rate, or you don't have to check this; it could be a fixed rate. But the one thing I wanted to point out is, if you're representing your buyer, you want to protect your buyer. So here we're saying that he has to be able to get a loan at no higher than 6.5%. Now, let's just say we go back a year or whatever it was when the rates just went through the roof. If your client was initially approved at a lower rate, and all of a sudden they went sky high right around the time you got your contract accepted, if you didn't fill an amount in here, they could not use the failure to get a loan at a rate they could afford as a reason for not going through with the contract. So if you're writing an offer for a buyer, protect the buyer. Talk to them, what's the maximum rate you would be okay paying? Or whatever they're pre-approved for, let them know that, just in case interest rates go crazy, I'm going to put in a rate and figure maybe a rate 1% higher than what they're pre-approved for, or something like that, or 0.5% higher than what they're pre-approved for. Put something in here, though, to protect them. Let's see. Let's just say they're using a down payment assistance program. Well, that's where you could use this section for that. If there's a second section you can use for that over here. I'm sorry, not here. Additional financing terms. You could list it here. They're using down payment assistance, but you need to disclose that to the seller if they are using down payment assistance. You got to be upfront and all that stuff. If it's going to be an owner-occupied property, you don't need to do anything under E3. But if it's going to be an investment property or a second home, you do need to check the appropriate box here. And that's so that you can be upfront and truthful with the lender that's going to be loaning on it, because they have different rates for different types of purchases. It's an investment property, might be a higher rate than for an owner-occupant. All right. Another thing, it sounds kind of stupid to have to say it, but make sure you get your buyers to sign on every single page, everywhere that it says buyer's initials. I can't tell you how often in compliance we need to send requests out to get pages DocuSign, get initials put in place, whether it's seller's initials or buyer's initials. It comes up regularly, probably on a daily basis. So just check through your paperwork, make sure it's right. Keep in mind, one simple mistake like a missing set of initials can make an entire page invalid on the contract. Okay, I already told you the things that are necessary to have a valid contract, A lot of these other things are just additional terms that are important to have included, but not required for a contract. But if you don't have the pages initialed, they're not part of the contract. Okay. All right. If you're asking for a seller credit to the buyer, this would be the spot that you want to put it. And you can define where that credit is going to be applied also. All right. And I want to point this out too while I'm at it. All of these codes in the left column, that's referring to this line number here. So line number J is all of this, K is all of this, so on and so forth. The second column is the portion within the contract. So paragraph 23 explains assignments. Paragraph 16 explains final verification of condition. That's your quick table of contents to get throughout the contract if you need a better understanding of what each of these lines are. Section L. Oh, let me back up. Final verification of condition. This is also known as the final walkthrough. All right. There is a particular zip forms document called verification of property condition, or VP. Every time you represent a buyer, you need to do your verification of condition, your VP, prior to the close of escrow. And that is required even if the buyers are going to allow the sellers to continue to occupy the property on a seller in possession or rent back for a certain period of time. You always want to do the verification of condition. Now, typically you're going to go there, you're going to walk through the house, and the verification of condition is basically just to make sure the house is still standing, they haven't, driven any holes through the walls, any of that stuff. But there is a box on the form. If the buyer is adamant they do not want to do a final walkthrough, there's a box you can check on the form and then have them sign saying VP waived. That should be a last resort, but one way or another, there should be a either VP waived checkbox or a verification of property completed and signed prior to the contracted close of escrow. Right? All right. Big section here, contingencies. That's section L. You have several contract contingencies. Most of them, going back to the old days that everybody used to use a particular number, which was 17 days, they default everything to 17 days, but it gives you the option of putting in a different number of days. So you can see here on this example, I put a loan contingency. Actually, I'm going to back up a second and just quickly explain what contingency means. A contingency is basically it's a protection for the buyer. It basically says that the buyer has, depending on the contingency, X number of days after acceptance to satisfy themselves at whatever that contingency is. And at the end of that period of time, they either have to remove the contingency and say that they're going to move forward with the purchase, or if they're not going to remove the contingency, then they're supposed to cancel the contract and not harm the seller any further by keeping the property off the market. That's kind of the two choices. Now, the thing about these contingencies is, although it says we have a loan contingency of 21 days here, on day 21, if the buyer does not remove the contingency in writing, and there's a form for that, then it simply goes to day 22. And at day 22, if they don't remove it, it goes to day 23. And it just keeps going on in perpetuity unless the seller objects. And if they object, their way of expressing that objection to you is they will send something called a notice to perform. And if they send a notice to perform over to the buyer for one or more contingencies, and the buyer still doesn't correct that problem, then you can see here, let me get this over. So if you come down to so if a buyer sends a notice to perform, if a seller sends a notice to perform, the seller has to wait 2 days. At the end of 2 days, if that thing isn't remedied, then the seller can just cancel on their own. They don't have to have a mutual agreement and signature of the buyer in order to cancel. They can just do it on their own. So if you ever get a notice to perform, you don't want to just sit on it and put your head in the sand, because if you do that and the buyer really does want to move forward and you haven't had this discussion with them, the next thing you might get from that seller is a cancellation. And once you get that, your contract is dead. So coming back up, here we go. So going back to your contingencies, this one here, loan contingency, you see I put 21 days here. Here's the issue. Don't just pull a number out of your rear end and put it in there. If you've got a financed buyer, who's somebody who's getting a loan, the smart thing to do before you write this offer is call the lender. Call the buyer's lender and say, look, I'm writing an offer on this property at such and such location. If I use 17 days for my loan contingency, can you get this thing appraised and get it through underwriting and get docs issued and all that stuff within 17 days, or do I need to use a different period of time? Use your partner. Your partner on this is your buyer's lender. Use them, get counseling from them, because ideally you want to get a go-ahead from your lender before you and your buyer agree to remove your loan contingency. So you want to have them on board from day one. Find out what is a reasonable number of days to put in that loan contingency field. Appraisal is the same thing. In a hot, crazy market, 17 days may or may not be enough time for an appraiser to get assigned, get out there, do the appraisal, and produce the report and get it back to underwriting. Let's see here. All right. So that's appraisal. Investigation of property. So they used to combine investigation of property with a lot of other things like review of seller documents. They've just recently broke review of seller documents out. But investigation of property would be things like getting your home inspection, or your buyer getting a home inspection, getting a roof report, getting a pest inspection, getting a pest, getting a sewer line inspection, all sorts of stuff like that. So home inspections are important. If you're representing a buyer, there's going to be certain forms, zip forms, again, that you're going to be using, where you're going to disclose to them the various types of inspections they should get, why they should get them. If they waive getting home inspections, they're going to have to sign saying, against your advice, they've decided not to get them. The other thing about investigation of property and various inspections, keep in mind that if the seller has ever been under contract with a previous buyer and it fell out of escrow, that previous buyer would have to turn over all of those inspections and reports to the seller. The reason they have to turn them over is because the seller is obligated under the law to give copies of those to any future buyer, meaning your client. Don't ever don't ever fall into the mistake of saying to your buyer, look, seller is going to give us their previous home inspection that was done a month ago. And there's no sense in you spending $500 or $550 for a brand new home inspection. We can just rely on that. No, don't ever say that. Your buyer is not protected by any mistakes that prior home inspector made. If they miss something and it comes back to bite your client in the butt, your client has no legal recourse against that prior home inspector, because there was no privity of what they call privity of contract between your buyer and that home inspector. They do have legal recourse against you, however, for negligence, for suggesting to them not to get their own home inspection. So it's okay to use those prior home inspections as a supplement to any home inspection you get. It's okay to use that prior pest inspection as a supplement to any pest inspection you get, but don't ever tell your client not to get their own, because that can come back and bite you in the rear. Informational access to property. This is not actually a contingency. This is the buyer's right to get into the property to look at something. For example, and typically this comes up where the buyer wants to get inside and measure the windows for new blinds or for curtains, or they want to take their parents into the property to show them. Basically, they've got 17 days after acceptance of the contract to do that. Review of seller documents. So when you list the house, seller is going to be completing various disclosures. They're going to do a transfer disclosure statement, an SPQ. They're going to provide a natural hazard disclosure statement or report, HOA documents, which actually are covered separately here. They're going to provide a lot of disclosures over to the buyer side. Basically, in this particular contract, the way I wrote it, the buyer would have 10 days to go through those disclosures and approve them. Now, also included in that 10 days would be your agent visual inspection disclosure that you have to complete, as well as the one that the listing agent had to complete. All of those should be completed and delivered to the buyer for signature, and then sent back to the seller for signature and the seller's agent for signature before the end of the buyer's inspection period. You're going to have to hustle a little bit, especially if you make this 10 days instead of 17. Preliminary title report. Once you open up escrow, the title company will email you within a day or two a preliminary title report. It will show you the condition of title as it stands at that time. It'll tell you who it's vested in, the type of vesting. So if it's in a trust or something like that, it'll note that it's in a trust. Let's see. It'll tell you if there's any tax liens, and it'll tell you your normal property tax liens and stuff like that. But if there's anything extraordinary that affects the seller or will affect the ability for the seller to transfer title to the buyer, that'll be referenced there as well. And most of those items can usually be rectified by the escrow officer and the title company during the escrow period. Common interest disclosures. So this would be like if the home were located in an HOA controlled community, the seller under the California Civil Code is required to make certain documents disclosed to the buyer. So if it's in an HOA, they have to provide the articles of incorporation of the HOA. They have to provide 1 year's worth of meetings of the board of directors, the notes from those meetings, I should say. They have to provide all the insurance info for the association, the bylaws, rules and bylaws of the association, and the clubhouse if they have one. Any issues concerning lawsuits that the association isn't currently involved in. And any major things like that. It's all required under the California Civil Code. and the seller has to pay for those documents to be disclosed. This next one, I highlighted this because this is really important right now. So many homes are being sold that have solar systems. And the thing about a solar system is many of them are purchased or are financed through PACE or HERO loans. If this is done and there's a PACE or a HERO loan on title for financing a solar system or a new HVAC system or something like that, if your buyer is using an FHA or a VA loan, they may have trouble closing escrow unless that PACE or HERO loan is paid off. And so if you've got a VA or an FHA buyer, one of the things you might want to consider is in the contract negotiation period is ensuring, writing it into the contract, that the seller will be paying off that loan at close of escrow. That said, if there's a solar system on the house, make sure you incorporate this zip form called solar into your contract. It requires the seller to completely disclose all the information about their solar system and any assignment of contracts that are necessary and so on and so forth. Possession usually occurs on the date of recording upon notice of recording. All right. There is, if you check this box, you can make it a certain time. I prefer to take the defaults myself and basically say, as soon as the escrow company finds out and tells us that the deed transferring title has been recorded, I let my client know and they're free to access the property. I'll meet them out there and get them their keys. Let's see. Here talks about the time period for the seller to deliver documents to the buyer, all of their disclosures, and it gives them 5 days after acceptance. It defaults to 7. I make it 5. You can make it even shorter than that, which is why when you're on the other side of the transaction and you take a listing, make sure you get them to do all their disclosure documents immediately, like as soon as the listing is taken. That way you've got them in your file. You're all signed. You're ready to go. As soon as you enter escrow, you can package up those documents and send them right over to the buyer side. And you can do that on day 1 instead of waiting up to day 5. Let's see. Over here, we get a section, items included. This is a really important section if there are things that you're in doubt as to whether they're included in the property or not. You know, it used to be that, the stove in a property, we always used to, assume that all stoves are included in the sale. But contrary to what most agents, thought, the fact of the matter was, if a stove, let's just say an electric stove, it's freestanding and it just plugs into the wall behind the stove, that is actually personal property. It looks like it should be included with the home, but it's no different than a washing machine or a dryer. It just plugs in. And so a few years back, actually several years back, we started having sellers that, were savvy about this stuff, and they'd close escrow and the buyers would show up at the house and the stove would be missing. And you get this big conflict and the agents get involved in the conflict. And what usually happens is the agent ends up buying the guy a new stove. Well, in order to avoid stuff like that happening, they added these sections to the contract. And so, look, whether it's a freestanding or built-in stove, if you write an offer for somebody, just put an X there. That way there's no doubt. If the MLS notes that the refrigerator, washer, and dryer are included, check the boxes here, because even though it's in the MLS, if you don't memorialize that into the purchase contract, the seller is not obligated to leave it in the property if they decide to change their mind. So if it says it in the MLS, put it in the contract. Here is an example, additional items included. Imagine, if you will, there is a waterfall feature in the backyard of this house, and it's not cemented down, it's not attached to a wall, it's just one of those big things you buy at Pottery Barn or whatever they call it, place out towards Roseville, Rockland. And it weighs 500 pounds and it's just stuck on the patio. And it's a waterfall that works. It's got a pipe running to it and whatever. It's freestanding. It's actually personal property. So even if it's said it's included in the sale in the MLS, you also want to add it here. Waterfall feature in backyard as an additional item included. Excluded items. Let's just say there's a junky old hot tub in the backyard that you look at it, clearly the damn thing doesn't work, but it's freestanding. It's just sitting there on the patio. If you don't check this box and write hot tub in backyard is excluded, close of escrow happens, seller can leave that sitting there and you can't do it. Your client can't do a damn thing about it. They're stuck having to get the sucker hauled away. Okay, so put the X box there and say that it is excluded. That way there's no doubts. Next section talks about the allocation of cost. Who's paying for what on the major aspects of the transaction. So first of all, and for whatever reason, and I think I can explain this, natural hazard zone disclosure report does not default to seller, but I always check it as seller. The reason I think it does not default to the seller is because under California law, the seller does not have to provide a third-party natural hazard zone disclosure report, but they are obligated to provide a natural hazard zone disclosure statement, which would normally be one part of and included in a third-party report. So I think that's why they didn't automatically say the seller has to provide this. But the difference is if a seller decides to save the $99 or $59 or whatever the charge is for the full third-party report that you can buy, if the seller decides to save that cost by doing the research themselves and filling out the statement, if they are wrong and they put the wrong answer on any of those disclosures, they can be held civilly liable for any damages, which is why it would never be smart for your seller to do that. The state assembly passed a law that said if a home seller and agents rely on a third-party natural hazard zone disclosure report, and there's a mistake made, that we have a safe harbor from litigation. They can't sue us over the mistake. So buyers, seller, agents, brokers on both sides are all free from the threat of litigation. So you always want to direct them towards a professional third-party report. So I put sellers paying for it. In this case, I wrote provided by Cap City NHD, which is our in-house NHD company. You can use any NHD company that you want. There's property ID, disclosure source, and probably 15, 20 other different companies. They all produce basically the same thing. They have the same information and they are all legally valid. Smoke alarms, CO detectors, water heater, and bracing, always the seller's responsible. Escrow fee. What's customary here generally is that it's split. If you put both on this box, the way this contract is interpreted is it is interpreted the same thing as saying right here 50/50, 50%. It's just whatever the cost is, it's divided equally amongst both. You don't need to state that in addition to just checking the box. Owner's title policy. This is what protects the buyer. And typically, it's usually more often than not, you'll see the seller is responsible for paying that. It's subject to negotiation though, but I always check seller. Buyers own this, by the way, this is also known as a CLTA policy. It's California Land Title Association, and that's based on the purchase price of the property. This other one, the buyer's lender's title insurance policy, if the buyer's getting a loan, buyer usually pays for that. That's called an ALTA policy. American Land Title Association produces it. And that one is based on the loan amount, not the purchase price. County transfer tax and fees, I usually put both are paying for that, so it'll be split. That's $1.10 per thousand. $1.10 per thousand? Yeah, $1.10 per thousand. The city transfer tax, that varies. Not all cities have them. In Sacramento, I think it's the calculation is 0.00275 times the purchase price. But that's a lot more steep than the county transfer tax, and I usually try to put that on the seller. HOA fee for preparing the disclosures, that defaults to the seller. HOA transfer fee gives you the option. I usually put that on the seller when I write an offer. There's a box here for private transfer fees. I want to talk about that briefly because although there are not a lot of areas that have them, and you won't see any more areas that will continue to have them because they're considered to be illegal now. There was a time in the 2000s in Roseville and Rockland primarily where these became fashionable, and they have never stopped once they were set up there. So if you sell a property in one of these areas that has a private transfer fee, it will be effective in your transaction, but the title companies will be aware of that. Briefly, what they were is when all the crazy building was going on in the 2000s, there were a bunch of developers that had a bunch of vacant land in Roseville and Rockland that they wanted to build on. And the Sierra Club and some other groups basically threatened to shut them down and file lawsuits ad nauseum, keep them in courts for years and years and years based on flawed environmental impact reports and things like that. Eventually, those builders struck a deal with the Sierra Club and these other organizations, and the deal was something along these lines. The very first time that you, Mr. Builder, sell a home to Mr. Buyer, there will not be any added private transfer tax. But every single sale after that initial sale of that one house, and basically all the houses in the development, but that house, every subsequent sale of that house, in addition to the normal transfer taxes, there will also be a private transfer tax that will be levied. That money will go into a special fund to benefit environmental groups to acquire vacant land and keep it vacant forever. And that is what the private transfer tax fees go to. And so, unless, there are no more new construction going on within those developments. So every sale that happens now is a resale, all of those within these particular developments. And I think Fitament was one of them, and there's a few others there. They all do have a private transfer fee. This contract defaults to the seller is going to pay for it. So unless you go in and change it to both or buyer, the seller is the one that's going to be obligated to pay the private transfer fee in the event and your offer is accepted. All right. Home warranty plan. This is a topic that is near and dear to me. Every single buyer that you represent, you should be writing into the contract that either the seller or your buyer will be paying for their own home warranty. Critically important for keeping you guys out of court. If a buyer closes escrow on a house and all of a sudden the appliances start failing, if they have a home warranty company, they basically pay a fairly small fee to get a service tech come out and fix that device per the home warranty. That enables them to be satisfied and not contact their lawyer and say, the seller had to have known about all these problems. The seller failed to disclose. The realtors must have known about it. They were in cahoots with the seller. They just wanted their commissions. And then you start going down that path that ends up with everybody going into depositions in court. So do your client a favor and always Don't even ask them. Tell them you're doing it. You're putting it in the report initially for the seller to pay for a home warranty. It may get countered back. If it gets countered back that the seller is not going to pay it, get the buyer to pay it. If they absolutely adamantly refuse, make sure that they waive the home warranty here. And of course, initial at the bottom of the page, acknowledging that they're waiving their own home warranty against your advice, right? You notice here I added in HVAC coverage. Most home warranties, you have to add that in as a writer. So you'll want to do that also. This page here, so it used to be that in addition to the standard residential purchase agreement, there were other separate standalone purchase agreements. There was, a probate agreement. There was a mobile home, manufactured home agreement. There were, mixed use purchase agreements, all sorts of stuff. The way they have redevised this thing is if you have one of these special types of sales, let's just say you're writing an offer for a mobile home, you would use the standard California residential purchase agreement. In zip forms, you're going to check this box here, which will add this form here. That's a manufactured home purchase addendum that you would incorporate into this contract. And that's the way all of these work. Also, super, super important. I can't even express how important this is. If you're working with a buyer on a piece of rural property or property that maybe it's not rural, but you happen to know that there is a well and or a septic system on the property, you want to definitely check this box when you're preparing this offer. It will add in this form SWPI. This form addresses wells, septic systems, property monuments, and propane tanks that are on the property. In particular, with the septic system, what this form does is it tells you who is going to pay, buyer or seller, to locate a septic system, who is going to pay to excavate the lids so that a septic inspector can go out there and get access in order to pump it and inspect the inside, and who's going to pay for the inspection. If you don't have this form and you go into contract and there is a septic system, I can tell you from my own personal experience that if you don't know the exact location of a septic system and exactly where the lids are, if the lids are buried by 3 or 4 feet of topsoil and they have to be excavated out, the hard clay has to be excavated out with a backhoe, it can cost you $1,500 to $2,000, which means it's costing your buyer $1,500 to $2,000 if you don't have this addendum added saying that the seller is going to be the one to locate it and do this. So very important. Likewise, with a well, if there's a well on the property, this form says who's going to pay for the pump to be inspected, who is going to pay to have the water quality run through a lab analysis to make sure that the water is drinkable, and who's going to pay to test the well to make sure that the water table is high enough to support a household. Very important stuff. So just remember, if you're dealing in rural property, you want to get this done as part of the contract formation, because you might well imagine after the contract is ratified, the seller might be a little reluctant to agree to do all this stuff, if they don't have to. So let's see here, a couple other things. So we're in the section right now where it's elaborating on stuff that was in that early part of the contract. So at close of escrow, condition on a property closing. You notice here it says the property shall be delivered as is in its present physical condition as of the date of acceptance of the offer. And then what it says is, if you read down a little farther, All debris and personal property not included in the sale shall be removed by close of escrow or at the time, or at the or at the time possession is delivered to the buyer, if not on the same date. It says, if items are not removed when possession is delivered to the buyer, all items shall be deemed abandoned. Buyer, after first delivering to seller a written notice to remove the items within 3 days, may pay to have them removed or disposed of, and may bring legal action as per the agreement to receive reasonable costs from the seller. This is in here, and I got to tell you, I'm not happy it's in here, but this is the law. If the seller leaves garbage on the property, buyer does not have a lot of recourse. And that sucks, but it's the reality. So they give you some options there. Buyer can give notice to the seller. And part of this problem is oftentimes you don't even have any idea where the seller can be contacted. You know, they close escrow on their property and they don't give escrow a forwarding address or something like that. You don't know if they've moved out of state or one block over. So it can be very difficult to try to pin down where a seller is located. At least that's been my experience. But this is the only remedy that it gives a buyer for this type of thing. You know, if you know where they moved to or where they have another house, you can at least, you know, take them to small claims court, get a judgment, file a lien against their house, you know, stuff like that. But to me, this is a really inadequate remedy for a buyer when they have to pay to dump all of a seller's garbage that they left on a property. But this is what it is. To make matters worse, let's just say your buyer has some flexibility and you're getting towards close of escrow, you do your final walkthrough, and the seller outright, you know, flat out tells you, well, I'm not getting rid of all that garbage I have in the backyard, I'm just leaving it there. Your buyer cannot legally refuse to close escrow for that. If your buyer did, your buyer would be breaching the contract. That would be considered a material breach and they could lose their deposit. So basically, your buyer, this is one of those things where your buyer just has to, you know, swallow something very distasteful and move on. Like I said, they can try to track down the seller, but more often than not, they're not going to have any luck. I've had a few of these come up recently where we knew the seller actually moved out of state. But then, you know, even if you had their address out of state, if you wanted to take them to small claims court, you still have to effect service on them. And then let's just say you paid a process server, they moved to Florida, you pay a process server in Florida to serve them for a small claims court action here in California, and they don't show up, you get a judgment against them. Well, you know, then you got to go and you got to try to find out if they own real property there. If they do, how are you going to get a lien or a judgment filed against that property? It's just, you're throwing that, you know, bad energy out for good. Anyway, I did want to mention that to you though, in case it comes up, in case your clients ask. It's a tough pill to swallow, but that is the pill. See here. This goes hand in hand with what I was talking about earlier, the buyer review of leased or liened items contingency. They actually made it a contingency. And that time is specified on the first page of the contract or the second page of the contract in section L. But for example, if there's a solar system, that's where this would come in. And we have a separate reference to the solar system. This is just an explanation, further explanation about that form, the SOLAR. And then right under it, known material facts. This is important for both buyers and sellers. Seller shall within the time specified in 3N1, disclose known material facts and defects affecting the property, including but not limited to known insurance claims within the last 5 years, provide buyer with permission to contact the insurer, blah, blah, blah. I'm sure you guys have heard on the news recently, there are property and casualty insurance companies that are pulling out of California due to flooding problems and fire problems. And costs of getting properties rebuilt. And that's a big deal because the more companies that pull out, the more business that the existing companies will have to absorb. So there's also, it's a little known fact, that there is a database. You can almost consider it to be like a credit bureau. And they track any property insurance claims on a property. So if there's been a claim within the last 5 years, that database, it's called the CLUE database, CLUE, will have evidence of that claim being filed. A lot of the NHD reports will also do a CLUE examination to see if there have been insurance claims filed. But it's a known material fact, which means the seller is legally obligated to disclose that to a buyer. And that's important to a buyer because if there have been property insurance claims against a property, it might be difficult for your buyer to obtain home insurance. Along with this topic of insurance right now, if you are representing any buyers in the foothills or in wooded areas, before you offer on a property, you would be wise to have the buyer contact their insurance agent and just get a kind of a ballpark, and the insurance guys will have a map. They can use their parcel map, and they can tell you right down to the property what it would cost to insure that home there. I can tell you, based on our experience with buyers in the foothills in 2020 even, you go 1 block, 2 blocks, one direction or another direction, and the difference in homeowners insurance could be a high of $3,000 to $4,000 a year or a low of $1,500 a year. Massive changes depending on exactly where that home was located. And these insurance companies are using Google Maps now to get satellite views to see exactly what's around a property and things like that. So don't wait until the week you're supposed to close escrow to knock off your insurance, to get your buyer to knock off their insurance agent and lock up that insurance plan for the lender, because 1 week's notice may not be enough, right? Let's see. All right, this is just quantifying the seller delivery of documents. I think, 5 days, 3 days, whatever you want it to be, the seller has to do it within that period of time, and we specified that earlier in the contract. Seller right to cancel. As an agent, you should know once a seller is under contract with a buyer, there are very, very limited methods that a seller has the right to cancel a contract. Basically, the buyer has to breach somehow. So what do I mean by breach? Well, they failed to remove a contingency wherein the seller side listing agent sends over a buyer notice to perform. The buyer fails to correct it, then the seller can cancel. Seller cannot just say, I've changed my mind. I don't want to sell the property anymore. If they do that, the buyer has a right to seek a remedy in court known as specific performance. Basically, it's a court order forcing the seller to sell the property to them. And they also have a right to damages. So, bad plan for a seller to try to cancel a contract in the absence of a buyer breaching. Buyer's right to cancel. As long as the buyer has not removed all of their contingencies, they can cancel for a contingency reason that they have not yet removed. So if property doesn't appraise for the purchase price, and the buyer has removed all contingencies except the loan and the appraisal contingency, If the property doesn't appraise, buyer can cancel and get their deposit back. If the buyer can't get a loan, they can cancel under the loan contingency provision. Now, that has to be done in good faith, though. The lender can't be saying to the buyer, Mr. Buyer, please, we've asked you 3 times, we need your last 2 years' tax returns. And the buyer who wants to get out of the contract just blows off the lender, doesn't send them, and then finally the lender says, I'm sorry, we can't do your loan. That's not a good faith cancellation, and the buyer could potentially end up losing their deposit. Buyer has to act in good faith, seller has to act in good faith. You can't try to concoct a reason for avoiding you can't concoct a reason for failing a contingency. But once the buyer removes all of their contingencies, if they try to cancel, the seller has a right to put a claim on their earnest money deposit. And the buyer has to, in good faith, release it if that's the reason. Talked about notices to perform. Once the seller or buyer issues a notice to perform, they have to wait at least 2 days after the delivery, and then at the end of that 2-day period, they can cancel. They don't need both the other party to agree to the cancellation. It can be unilateral, just be one of them deciding, I no longer want to do this, contract's dead, here's my cancellation. Closing escrow requires a different form of a notice to perform. It's not called a notice to perform. Closing escrow is one that requires a specific form. It's called a demand to close escrow. And for a demand to close escrow, and this would come into effect, for example, when either the seller is refusing to close or the buyer is refusing to close, or maybe the buyer isn't refusing, maybe their lender hasn't gotten their crap together, and so the buyer is not in a position yet to close. Either way, the other party sends a demand to close escrow. They must wait 3 days after delivery. After that 3 days, they can simply cancel. Again, doesn't need both signatures. Now, for both the notice to perform and the demand to close escrow, you don't technically have to wait until the date that the other party was supposed to perform before you can issue a notice to perform or demand to close escrow. The notice to perform can be sent 2 days prior to the end of the contingency period date. And then if they wait 2 days, on the day that contingency is supposed to be removed, they can cancel. So bear that in mind. Same with a demand to close escrow. If the seller believes that the buyer is going to flake right on the day escrow closes, 3 days before close date, they can send a demand to close escrow. And on the date, I would say wait until the day after the date that they were supposed to close escrow, they can send a cancellation. Attorney's fees and costs. Any action, proceeding, or arbitration, the prevailing buyer or seller is entitled to reasonable attorney's fees and costs. And then this is the big section I wanted to cover. There is a section in the contract. It's on page 14 of 16. And this is the page that has all the dispute remediation type stuff. So the first thing it has is liquidated damages. If in order for a seller to have a claim on buyer's earnest money deposit for liquidated damages, both buyer and seller has to initial this paragraph. If the buyers initial it, but the sellers don't, this paragraph does not become effective. All right. That's liquidated damages. Then the next part of this clause that we get to is mediation. So for those of you who don't know, mediation, it's the legal equivalent of going to a psychologist. Let's just say marital counseling. You have a husband and wife. In this case, you have a buyer and a seller. You go to a counselor, in this case, a mediator, and a mediator is usually an attorney, usually a real estate lawyer. Sometimes they're retired judges, things like that. Both sides pay the fee for the mediator. The minimum fee is about $400. That's what you pay to the CAR Real Estate Mediation Center. And then in addition to that, I think the minimum attorney's fees are for about 3 hours worth of work. So you got about $900 to $1,200 in attorney's fees split between the parties. That's a requirement. And then basically each side lays out their case to the mediator, and the mediator will listen to them and say, well, Mr. Buyer, if Mr. Seller does this, will you agree to do that? Mr. Seller, if Mr. Buyer does this, will you agree to do that? And the mediator tries to come up with some sort of a compromise. And if the mediator can, they'll put together a release and settlement document. Everybody signs it, everybody's happy, and that ends the dispute. The mediator cannot make a decision on their own. Nothing they say to buyer or seller is binding. They can't give legal advice to the buyer or seller. It's just to help facilitate those two parties working out between themselves a solution. If mediation fails, then the next step that you might go to would be arbitration. Now, arbitration is a whole different animal. Arbitration it's done by an arbitrator. The arbitrator is usually a retired judge. Arbitration is like a bench trial in court. A trial without a jury. You have a judge that makes a decision. That's what the arbitrator does. And the arbitrator takes evidence from both sides. The arbitrator will take statements. They may have depositions done. It's a lot cheaper than hiring lawyers and going into court, but there's still some expenses involved. Both parties pay for the arbitrator. They present evidence. In the end, the arbitrator is going to make a decision. Either you win or you win. And it's binding, completely binding. So that's that. And in most cases, these actions have to be resolved by attempting mediation first and then going to arbitration. There are a couple of exceptions to this, and the exclusions are matters that are excluded from mediation or arbitration. And those are probate court issues, any issue that can be handled through small claims, if it's a bankruptcy court issue, if it's an eviction or an unlawful detainer, or if it involves a judicial or non-judicial foreclosure. But other than that, mediation and arbitration is going to be the solution. Again, both buyer and seller need to sign here or initial here. And then we get to the final important section where the buyers sign. So here, John Smith is going to sign, Jane Smith is going to sign, they're going to date it. And then the seller is going to do one of a couple things. If they're just going to accept the offer as it comes in, they're not going to check anything here. If they're going to counter, they're going to check this box right here, and they're going to sign the contract as if they were approving it, except with this box here checked, and they will send back to the buyer side this signed contract along with a seller counteroffer form, that's the SCO, or if they're countering to multiple offers, multiple people, they'll send a seller multiple counteroffer form out along with a copy of this signed contract. And then it'll be in the hands of the buyers to decide if they want to engage those counteroffers and respond back. Now I wanted to show you here, let's just say, for example, that Hans and Franz Gruber are actually the trustees of a trust. That's very common these days. People own properties in a trust. If you're smart, and especially if you have kids or people that you want to get your assets, you're going to establish a living trust. So in this case, if I check this box here, because I know that the sellers are a trust. I check that the sellers are an entity. And if you look here, number 4 says, if a trust, identify the seller as trustees of the trust or by a simplified trust name, blah, blah, blah. And so I did that here. The 2020 Gruber Family Living Trust, that's the name of it. That's the entity. And then down below, I filled it in. And a lot of times, if you don't know this information, the listing agent can check this box, fill this in, put their client's names here, have them sign it. But Hans Gruber, co-trustee, along with Franz Gruber, co-trustee, they sign it. If the seller does it in this manner, he does not have to complete this, what's called a representative capacity signature disclosure form. So this basically eliminates one other form that you have to do, makes things a little bit easier. If the seller does not accept your offer, they are supposed to initial this page here, put a date here, and send the form back to your agent to note that your offer was not accepted. And then this final page here, I wrote the offer. I'm going to sign it here under my brokerage, Keller Williams Realty, Sac Metro. Again, brokerage license number here, my personal license number here, address. You notice here, I put my email address, bruce.hammer@kw.com. I also checked this box here under the designated electronic delivery address. What this does is this says, as long as, Mr. Listing Agent, you send me a signed contract or any kind of contract documents related to this transaction, if you send them to my email address, once you click send, it's assumed that I got it. Likewise, if Vin Diesel at his email address of vinny2knife@sellersrealty.com, if you fill that in for him and he actually signs it, any stuff that you send to his electronic delivery address, which is that email here, it's assumed he received it. He can't come back later and say, oh, sorry, my email must have glitched. I never got it from you. So it can just kind of circumvent any problems down the road. Again, presentation of offers, brokerage certifying that they presented them. You want to make sure all the buyers and sellers' signatures are done. This is a buyer's investigation advisory. This is telling the buyer at the time of the offer, all the stuff, what we do, what they're supposed to do, what our responsibilities are, what there are, all the stuff they should be paying attention to, and various inspections that they should be looking into. They're going to acknowledge they got it. Fair Appraisal Housing Act addendum. This is something new that was just required starting in 2022. And this is designed to prevent race discrimination based on an appraiser's perception of who they believe or the color of the people they believe are occupying a property. And that actually is a thing. It's been proven with several studies. And then California Consumer Privacy Act advisory, more informational stuff for your client. And that's it for the 26-page residential purchase agreement package that you will get and use from Zip Forms. Any quick questions I can answer for you guys? No? All righty. Well, if there's nothing further, I will see you next week. Have a good day.
That was great.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Talk to you later.